Dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you, duck and cover.
Imagine this hypothetical. A material is found that has the potential to unlock nearly unlimited energy. Although the scientific community familiar with this discovery knows that the material is dangerous to organic life, no one knows exactly how dangerous the material is, what its short and long-term effects are, and in what doses these effects manifest. Without this knowledge, a group of scientists embark upon and lead a secret project that consciously requires several thousand people to be exposed to the material. Outside this leadership group, most of the people involved in this secret project are unaware they are being exposed. During the secret project, nearly the entire team is exposed to the material. Some members are more exposed than others. The project's leadership studies how and why certain workers are injured, how much their doses were, and what the effects of their exposures are. Despite these injuries, the secret project continues and more individuals are exposed. Many are injured in ways that are not apparent until several decades later. At the same time the workers are being exposed, the scientists also conduct a parallel series of animal exposure experiments. For most of the animal experiments, the death of the subjects are a given. Eventually, the scientists decide passive human observation and animal exposure experiments are not enough. Instead, they devise a series of experiments that would see them purposely inject the material into human test subjects. But how could the scientists possibly ask for volunteers for such a dangerous and unpredictable study? They could not and did not. Instead, these scientists secretly injected scores, if not hundreds, of unknowing people with the material, just to see what happened. Many of these uninformed test subjects suffered adverse effects, some severe. Meanwhile, the secret project continued to inflict an immeasurable amount of harm on everyone exposed to the dangerous material. These effects were further studied by the project's leadership. Even more disturbing than the secret harm the project inflicted on its workers and the public is the project's ultimate objective. The purpose of the secret project was to create a weapon capable of vaporizing an entire city in an instant. Indeed, the scientists were successful in this secret project. The city-destroying devices they created were used to obliterate 2 metropolitan areas, killing approximately 200,000 civilians. When the secret project was publicized, the scientists were heralded as heroes instead of denounced as mass murderers. The harm done to their fellow citizens and project members was swept under the rug. Is this story some kind of twisted horror cosmic from the fevered mind of a fiction writer? No. This is the hidden history behind Christopher Nolan's new film, Oppenheimer. Part 1. Human experimentation in the radiological weapons group. During World War II, the Manhattan Project and its mission was known only to a small group of scientists, military brass, and government officials. Author Lisa Martino Taylor writes, "Secrecy in the Manhattan Project was so complete that many people working for the organization did not know what they were working on until they heard about the bombing of Hiroshima on the radio. Even those in the know were not aware of the many layers of secrecy. Manhattan Project leader Lieutenant General Leslie Groves insisted upon complete compartmentalization of tasks and basic information and maintained rigid control of all project talk, even between spouses. Therefore, even those involved in the Manhattan Project were unaware that it had birthed an equally sinister brood, a sub-program that would further the project's wholesale inversion of medical and scientific ethics in the pursuit of mass murder. It is admittedly impossible to gaze into the minds of men, but there are clues. And in reviewing the correspondence of the architects of these programs, it seems they justified this destruction of medical ethics as an ugly means of avoiding a worse result, or so they told themselves. Specifically, this was the expansion of National Socialism. However, that justification rings false. Instead of defending the American people and eliminating its foes, the Manhattan Project violated medical ethics. In doing so, it fixed U.S. civilians in its crosshairs alongside their ostensible enemies in Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The ugly truth is that the Manhattan Project trampled medical ethics not unlike the famous Nazi medical experiments and the horrors of Imperial Japan's Unit 731. Indeed, while it appeared to the world that the United States was leading the international prosecution of Nazi war criminals, a small circle of Manhattan Project scientists intentionally exposed U.S. citizens to dangerous levels of radiation without their knowledge or consent, often with no perceived or expected medical benefit. Many of these experiments resulted in severe adverse health effects and even death. They persisted throughout the remainder of the 20th century, even after the war. The stated purpose of these experiments was to better understand the effects of radiation on the human body for the protection of nuclear scientists, Manhattan Project staff, and the American public. This was only a half-truth. Its true purpose was much more sinister. At the time, the small subset of the Manhattan Project was unnamed. For the purpose of this series, this small group of scientists will be called the Radiological Weapons Group. Their true mission? The express development of offensive radiological weapons. Radiological warfare, as defined by the Department of Defense, is the use of radioactive substances to produce personnel casualties or to deny the enemy full use of terrain or installments due to the physiological damage which will result from continued occupation of the area. Further, the dispersal of radiological agents does not involve an atomic bomb, but can include use of conventional explosives to disperse radioactive material over a given area. Some allege that the concept of radiological weapons, like many modern technological advancements, was birthed from science fiction. In May 1941, Robert Heinlein published Solution Unsatisfactory, a story about the use of radioactive dust as a weapon. The idea for the story was first given to Heinlein by his editor, John W. Campbell, who would later pen a July 1941 nonfiction piece entitled, "Is Death Dust America's Secret Weapon?" In this case, it is not immediately clear if life imitates art or vice versa. As the second installment of this docuseries will explore, just 2 years after Heinlein's piece, the Manhattan Project's Radiological Weapons Group had already begun to weaponize radiation alongside human tracer experiments at Los Alamos. Radiological Weapons Group research was conducted in close coordination with affiliated Manhattan Project facilities at the University of Rochester, UC Berkeley, the University of Chicago, and the Manhattan Project's Oak Ridge facility. By 1943, these facilities were intimately connected with the Manhattan Project. Much of the radioactive material it used was created in these universities' radiology departments. These universities also conducted some of the first medical radiation research involving animal and human experimentation. As a subset of the Manhattan Project, the Radiological Weapons Group shared many of its core members. The group itself was devised by the medical director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Dr. Louis Hempelman, at the request of his supervisors, Los Alamos Director Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, and by the director of the Manhattan Engineer District, Army Colonel Stafford Leake Warren. It also included Manhattan Project Health Division directors Joseph Hamilton, Robert Stone, and Wright Haskell Langham. Again, one may only speculate as to the true intentions of these men in devising such sinister applications for their research. One must also wonder if these men were driven by evil, ego, sense of duty, or a utilitarian ends justify the means approach. A brief discovery of their backgrounds, however, reveals a common irreverence for medical and scientific ethics. As the director of the Los Alamos facility, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer is the man most popularly credited for the atom bomb's creation. Lesser known is his checkered past. During his first year of graduate study at the UK's Cambridge University, Oppenheimer was diagnosed with, quote, profound schizophrenia that psychoanalysis will not benefit, after an acute deterioration of his mental state that began in the fall of 1925. This mental decline would see Oppenheimer muttering repeated phrases to himself and collapsing in a heap to the university's laboratory floors to roll around. Oppenheimer's diagnosis came in the fall of 1925 after he attempted to poison his supervising professor with a chemical, reportedly cyanide, obtained from a university laboratory. Oppenheimer's wealthy parents intervened to save his career by convincing Cambridge not to expel him and to recommend the dismissal of criminal charges. Oppenheimer was instead placed on academic probation, which required he submit to mandatory psych evals. During the winter of 1925 to 26, Oppenheimer continued to struggle emotionally. According to close friend and Harvard classmate Francis Ferguson, Oppenheimer confided an incident where he became angry at a couple kissing on the train. After the male left the carriage, Oppenheimer reportedly kissed the woman and immediately fell to his knees, apologizing and crying, begging for her forgiveness. However, after Oppenheimer and the couple had departed the train and were descending the station steps, he threw his suitcase at the woman's head and missed, or so he told Ferguson. Despite these measures, Oppenheimer again attempted murder in January of 1926 when he began to strangle Ferguson with a leather trunk strap. Thankfully for Oppenheimer, this event did not occur on university grounds. Instead, it occurred in Paris, where Oppenheimer's parents had taken him for the winter term while he was on the brink of expulsion. Aside from Ferguson, there were no witnesses to this event. Ferguson was a close friend that understood Oppenheimer's fevered mental state, which according to Ferguson bordered on the suicidal. Oppenheimer later admitted this event happened and apologized to Ferguson. After his graduate studies, Oppenheimer accepted a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship at the California Institute of Technology and eventually began working at the UC Berkeley. By many accounts, Oppenheimer's schizophrenia did not hamper his charisma. Quote, his opponents claimed that he had the uncanny ability to turn bright men, even geniuses, into slavish followers. This charisma likely caused him to be selected to lead the Manhattan Project by Lieutenant General Groves. While Oppenheimer had only attempted murder, other radiological weapons group scientists had arguably succeeded. Throughout the 1930s, an insidious duo of future radiological weapons group scientists had already conducted several dubious human radiation experiments, the ethics of which were questionable at best. They were radiologist Robert S. Stone and his then intern Joseph G. Hamilton. In the mid-1930s, Stone and Hamilton were both recruited by UC Berkeley, quote, to develop biomedical applications for the Berkeley cyclotron. A cyclotron is a machine that was originally designed to produce high-energy ion beams for nuclear physics experiments. However, as these ion beams were also able to penetrate the body, attention quickly turned towards developing biomedical applications for the beams and the radioisotopes they produced. Although Stone was a decade older than Hamilton, it was Hamilton who first stimulated Stone into working with him on these applications. Hamilton himself had become inspired by the work of John and Ernest Lawrence, who, after inventing the cyclotron, attempted to employ the use of radioactive material in the treatment of cancer. After arriving at UC Berkeley, Stone and Hamilton got to work. In 1936, the scientists injected 2 leukemia patients with, quote, substantial doses of radioactive sodium. The doctor's follow-up report did not indicate, quote, whether the patients knew what was being administered or gave their permission. It only indicated there had been a consultation. No severe adverse effects were documented, but neither were long-term effects. This experiment is widely regarded to be, quote, the first clinical administration of radioisotopes in humans. A year later, in 1937, Stone and Hamilton conducted a second study documenting the effects of radioactive sodium on the human body. In it, 8 healthy participants drank a solution of radioactive sodium. The subjects then placed their hand in a lead-lined box, where a Geiger counter traced the solution's dispersal through their bodies by measuring its radioactivity. Although he thanked the willing cooperation of the experimental subjects, Dr. Hamilton's report does not indicate that the subjects were given informed consent of the nature of the study's risks. Although neither of these studies caused severe adverse effects to the subjects, it is clear that Hamilton and Stone engaged in human experimentation with little or no expectation of medical benefit. Dr. John Lawrence, their Berkeley colleague, would later express the opinion that these experiments were a, quote, stunt, and that Stone and Hamilton simply wanted to rush into using an isotope on a sick patient. But Stone and Hamilton did not stop with their radiosodium experiment, as author Eileen Wellsome writes in her expose, The Plutonium Files. With the help of another young scientist named Paul Aebersold, Stone began using the neutron beam from the Rad Lab cyclotron for his human experiments. Between December of 1939 and September of 1941, he bombarded some 128 patients with neutrons. They were irradiated in a small lead-lined chamber adjacent to the cyclotron. Some of these patients came from the University of California, San Francisco's outpatient clinic and were in good or fair condition. Others came from the Visible Tumor Clinic and were deemed to be suffering from cancers that could not be cured by normal surgical or X-ray treatment. Still others were apparently well-to-do individuals who had been referred to Stone by other doctors. At first, everything seemed to go well. As the experiment progressed, however, it became clear that Stone had underestimated the biological effects of neutrons. Although they are effective at killing cancer cells, they are difficult to control and can cause a lot of collateral damage as well. Nearly half of the patients died within 6 months of the treatment period. Many of the subjects suffered horribly from the side effects. Some developed gruesome skin damages that one radiobiologist likened to armor plates. Others eventually died of malnutrition rather than their underlying disease because they had such painful ulcers in their mouths they couldn't eat. Although Stone acknowledged the statistics were discouraging, he nevertheless recommended that neutron therapy be continued because the neutrons did shrink tumors and in some cases cause them to disappear altogether. Indeed, Dr. Stone's own report remarked on the severity of adverse reactions to the exposures. Mild reactions consisted of a moderate degree of anorexia. They were seen in 76 patients during treatment and in 72 patients during the first month after treatment. The reactions of nausea and general malaise were classified as moderately severe. They became so severe that the patients required supportive medication, such as thiamine chloride. They occurred in 28 patients during treatment and in 29 in the following month. When all the symptoms mentioned were intensified, the reactions were classified as severe. In many cases, they were accompanied by vomiting and dehydration. These reactions occurred in 12 patients during the treatment and in 16 during the month after treatment. The patients responded to supportive medication of intravenous saline and 10% glucose in daily doses of 500 cc for several days. 4 patients were considered as improved because they were relieved of pain and did not have new symptoms of sufficient severity to place them in any other classification. Few systemic or local reactions occurred in the patients with carcinoma of the prostate. Irradiation of the upper abdomen, however, caused severe systemic reactions and diarrhea in almost all cases, undoubtedly due to reaction in the mucous membrane of the intestinal wall. Some of the patients who were treated about the head and neck had such severe mucositis that they had great difficulty in eating and lost considerable weight. To prevent the development of malnutrition and dehydration was a rather difficult problem, especially since the hospital facilities for taking care of these patients were very unsatisfactory, so that most of them had to remain in their own homes or in boarding houses. Because the patients all had cancer, that mere fact does not mean that they were killed by Dr. Stone. In his own report, however, Stone admits that approximately 26 of his patients died, quote, either because their tumors were uncontrolled or because radiation brought about conditions incompatible with life. Interestingly, he earlier admits that, quote, 14 of his patients were so sick that they probably should not have been treated. Much like the radiosodium injection experiments, it is unclear how these patients were selected for treatment or if their informed consent was obtained. Stone's report merely states that, quote, they were selected. He further writes, an analysis of the conditions at the time of death or shortly before death revealed many interesting findings. Of the 61 patients who died, partial or complete autopsies were performed on 31. In 11 of these, so much cancer was still present that it was considered the cause of death. 12 patients had such persistent ulceration and pain that they were unable to eat. Their deaths were ascribed to inanition. 2 patients died of hemorrhage into the necrotic areas and 1 of laryngeal obstruction from edema. Stone's radiation experiments were later condemned by the Atomic Energy Commission, but this condemnation did not occur until half a century after Stone was selected to lead the Manhattan Project Health Division, situated at the University of Chicago's Met Lab, where he conducted more human experiments. In his own right, Joseph G. Hamilton was infamous around the Berkeley campus for, quote, engaging in flagrant safety violations and reckless on-the-job antics, such as drinking radioactive iodine in front of students during lectures, handling radioactive material without gloves, and purposely running through the highly dangerous cyclotron area without protective gear. Despite these concerns, Hamilton would be selected to lead the Manhattan Project Health Division, located at UC Berkeley. In addition to his collaboration with Dr. Robert Stone, Dr. Joseph Hamilton participated in other human radiological experiments. This included, quote, a collaboration with Mayo Soli of the UC San Francisco's Medical School to administer iodine-131 orally to patients. In early 1941, Dr. Louis Hempelman observed the work of Drs. Robert Stone and Joseph Hamilton at UC Berkeley, which included Dr. Stone's ill-advised neutron beam experiments and Dr. Hamilton's radioactive phosphorus trials. After his UC Berkeley studies, Hempelman was assigned to the University of Rochester, where his supervising professors expressed strong concern that he, quote, might be a little too enthusiastic about their clinical results, which included human radiation experiments. In 1942, after studying at an assortment of American universities, including the University of Rochester, Hempelman accepted a position at Washington University's School of Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. His position was funded in part by the Rockefeller Foundation. Once there, Hempelman personally injected patients, quote, several times per week with radioactive material produced by the Washington University cyclotron, and he soon became uneasy when some of the patients developed dangerously low blood counts and even hemorrhages. It wasn't long after these experiments that Hempelman was selected by Oppenheimer to be medical director at Los Alamos, even though at the time Hempelman was 29 years old and had only been working with radiation for 3 years. Like Hempelman, another key member of the radiological weapons group, Wright Haskell Langham, had also studied under Dr. Robert Stone at UC Berkeley. Also like Hempelman, Langham reportedly showed a keen enthusiasm for human radiological experimentation. Langham had barely earned his PhD in biochemistry just before he joined the radiological weapons group in 1944, but he would soon become, quote, active in correlating nearly all of the toxicological work on plutonium and related elements for Los Alamos, the Argonne National Lab, Rochester, and later the programs at Utah and other laboratories. One may speculate that these scientists were selected not for their intellect or work ethic, but for their connections, shared vision, and demonstrated willingness to push ethical boundaries. Oppenheimer was a card-carrying communist, a diagnosed schizophrenic, and an attempted murderer. Hamilton was a pariah for laboratory safety. Stone, Hamilton, and Templeman had all violated medical ethics by irradiating patients with little expectation of medical benefit, and in most cases without informed consent. Templeman and Langham both expressed enthusiasm for human radiological experimentation. Nevertheless, by 1942, the Radiological Weapons Group was assembled and had begun their work on the Manhattan Project in earnest. Like their university research, human experimentation soon followed. It began with Templeman, who, as a function of his position as medical director of the Los Alamos National Laboratories, quote, engaged in health and mortality data collection when his colleagues were exposed to radiation. As medical director at Los Alamos, Templeman was acutely aware that the Manhattan Project was one of the first times in history where so many individuals were being exposed to radioactive material. Dr. Stone himself stated, quote, the whole clinical study of the Manhattan Project personnel is one vast experiment. Never before has so large a collection of individuals been exposed to so much irradiation.
We were all well trained in our fields, but the field of radiation biology was almost unknown. I said we had an idea what was going on, but it's pretty primitive. A safety committee gradually evolved, which I must say wasn't my idea. It was pretty primitive by standards of today, for example. And I think it was not only primitive there, but it was primitive everywhere. For example, when plutonium came in, nobody had ever worked with plutonium before. So all the doctors on the Manhattan Project went up to the medium dial painting plant up in Boston to see how they handled theirs. Plutonium and radium are quite similar. They give off the same radiation. They worked under a hood, and they would clean it up and test the contaminated area for actual contamination. So our procedures were patterned after that. Of course, what the dial painters did was a quite simple operation with minute quantities of radium, whereas our people were doing complex chemical and metallurgical procedures with kilograms.
In response to this unique situation, a special hospital was built on the hill at Los Alamos, where Templeman was in charge of the stricken scientists when they arrived at the hospital, and doctors would have a chance to observe what would happen to a healthy person exposed to radiation from an atomic weapon, without the confounding effects of blast or burn. Templeman isolated and followed stricken employees exposed to acute radiation doses during their lingering demise. Although these accidental exposures gave opportunity for Templeman and his ilk to study the effects of radiation, passive observation quickly proved insufficient for the Radiological Weapons Group's purposes. The scientists were simply unable to control any variables, which is a crucial element in scientific research. To overcome this, the Radiological Weapons Group began to petition in earnest to begin human tracer experiments. In May 1943, Oppenheimer received a request from Joseph Hamilton, his former Berkeley colleague. Hamilton's letter detailed the aims and methods of human tracer experiments and iterated his eagerness to conduct them. I'm extremely anxious to have the opportunity to talk over with you questions which bear upon the problems of infection by fission products. I expect that if all goes well, the work will have progressed to the point where one phase of the desired information will be essentially completed. This phase involves the behavior of the principal long-life fission products when introduced into the body by mouth, by injection, and directly into the lungs. Hamilton, 1943. In April 1944, Templeman had begun planning, quote, animal radiation inhalation studies using radioactive dust along with a human clinical investigation. He wrote a classified letter to Manhattan Engineer District Director Colonel Stafford Warren. I have Oppenheimer's permission to get a good biochemist to help us undertake a clinical investigation of the men, and I also obtained permission to expose any animals which you might send us. I have made arrangements to have some special dry boxes built, which can be contaminated with dust of any material we want to study, and these should be ready within a week or so. The petitions were well received. J. Robert Oppenheimer officially authorized a human radiation injection study program on August 16, 1944, though the program had already been arranged for months. Oppenheimer wrote, "I should like herewith to authorize you to undertake 2 programs. A. The development of methods of detection of plutonium in the excreta. B. The development of methods of detection of plutonium in the lung. We both agree that if this program is to be effective, it must be prosecuted with rather high priority. We both agree that in view of the many urgent problems facing the laboratory, it should be carried out with as small an investment of personnel as possible. As far as the biological sides of the work, which may involve animal or even human experimentation, I feel that it is desirable if these can any way be handled elsewhere, not to undertake them here. I suggest that you and I discuss the biological questions with Colonel Warren at a very early date." Oppenheimer, August 16, 1944. On August 23, 1944, quote, "A proposal for a secret human radiation research program was submitted by Hempelmann, whereby the Radiological Weapons Group would oversee covert human subject radiation research under Colonel Stafford Warren's order and Hempelmann's program coordination." The letter read, "Colonel Warren has suggested that I summarize the biological research program which was agreed upon in our conference with you and Mr. Kennedy on 25th August 1944. This program, which will be pursued with a relatively high priority, will consist of 3 parts. 1. The development of chemical methods of determining plutonium in the excreta and in tissues, and of ionization methods of detecting plutonium in the lungs. 2. Animal experimentation to check those methods described above. 3. Tracer experiments on humans to determine the percentage of plutonium excreted daily. When satisfactory analytical methods have been developed in this laboratory, the problem of carrying out further metabolic studies will be turned over to another medical group, presumably the Rochester Group. It was also decided that the Rochester Group should undertake a series of experiments with plutonium supplied by this project to determine the lethal dose in animals." In a series of correspondences, Hempelmann proposed that all 5 Manhattan Project locations work in tandem to conduct the tracer experiments. It was ultimately decided that the animal trials would occur concurrently at the Los Alamos and Rochester facilities, with the Oak Ridge facility to provide the test subjects. The plutonium was to be issued from Los Alamos. After 4 months of animal experimentation, the project moved to human testing. On March 2, 1945, Hempelmann wrote, "The Manhattan District is asked to help make arrangements for a human tracer experiment to determine the percentage of plutonium excreted daily in the urine and feces. It is suggested that a hospital patient at either Rochester or Chicago be chosen for injection of from 1 to 10 micrograms of material and that the excreta be sent to this laboratory for analysis." Just a few days after Hempelmann's recommendation that a hospital patient be injected with plutonium, Wright Langham sent 5 micrograms of plutonium to Dr. Heimer Friedel with instructions for their use on a human subject. As we will see in part 2 of this series, much of the human experiments that followed were conducted without the informed consent, or in many cases even the knowledge of their subjects. The experiments were not supported by medical necessity, and in some cases even intentionally caused harm. These experiments were not isolated, and did not cease with the end of the Second World War. Indeed, with no enemy left to fight, the war's end would only pan the project's crosshairs further inward. The human radiation studies conducted by the Radiological Weapons Group shock the conscience. They have no place in a just and moral society. Nonetheless, they occurred, abetted by a veil of secrecy, untouched by an unknowing and apathetic populace. The vast majority of its victims ignored and left without acknowledgement, meaningful reform, or recourse. And now, a blockbuster film by acclaimed director Christopher Nolan has the effect of further burying the secret history by controlling the narrative around the Manhattan Project. The true story of the Manhattan Project and its atrocities is an embodiment of the ends justify the means worldview on the grandest and most dire scale. In a time where the world once again teeters on the brink of nuclear war, it is important to recall the evil that is wrought by an ends justify the means approach. In Part 2, we will explore the Radiological Weapons Group's scheme to develop radiological weapons and the depravity of their first human radiation experiments. For Part 2, subscribe to my podcast, Vital Descent, and hit the bell icon on YouTube to get notifications of future uploads. And head to vitaldescent.com for show notes and a hyperlink transcript to source material. Also, check out the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.